A mighty U.S. Navy warship set sail into international waters, fitted with the latest technologies, when suddenly, it's seized by a country no one expected would have the power to challenge America. One of the most astonishing Cold War military maneuvers was pulled off by North Korea, a country that most of us view as an errant threat. The USS Pueblo has been captured and its crew tortured while the whole world ponders. This could just be the flashpoint for World War III? This is the untold story of how one encounter changed the landscape of modern naval warfare for good. This was a time when the Cold War had degenerated to ages of sheer negative propaganda toward one another. On January 23, 1968, a U.S. Navy warship, a paradigm of American military might and advanced technology, was captured in international waters by a nation that, at the time, seemed like no match for the United States. The seizure of the highly classified USS Pueblo intelligence-gathering vessel at the hands of the North Korean Navy represented the first recorded instance of a U.S. warship being seized by an enemy force. It was therefore more than a military loss. It was a diplomatic disaster. 82 members of the Pueblo, all sailors, were taken hostage, tortured, and paraded before the world's press as pawns in North Korea's game of power. The United States found itself in a quagmire, already deeply engaged in the fight against communism in Vietnam. Stretched thin worldwide, retaliation could have sparked World War III, and turning the other cheek could undermine U.S. credibility. On one hand, the USS Pueblo incident put the U.S. Navy under pressure, while on the other hand, it brought the very limits of U.S. military strategy, intelligence, and diplomacy into sharp focus. The consequences of that incident, as the world looked on, would reach far beyond mere political considerations, fundamentally recasting the role of the U.S. Navy in the present day. What happened next? Months of tense diplomatic maneuvering, prolonged savagery and captivity, and maneuver that would forever alter the rules of engagement in U.S. foreign policy theater. It all stemmed from that single, shocking, and brazen act by the North Koreans. This is the unseen account of how North Korea commandeered an American naval warship, and how everything that followed changed the nature of military engagement forever. The USS Pueblo and its secret mission. There was nothing ordinary about the USS Pueblo. This was a ship hidden behind a veil of Cold War secrecy. Originally built in 1944 as a cargo vessel, it was repurposed in the 1960s as an intelligence-gathering vessel for the United States Navy. It was loaded with sensitive intercept radar systems to gather communications from enemy forces, acting as a floating intelligence post sailing in the waters, monitoring signs of Soviet or North Korean military activities. The world was on the brink of disaster, and the consequences of such an action were unpredictable. The Cold War lingered on, and the giants, namely the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, were busy strategizing. While just off the coast of South Korea, it became an epicenter of possible conflict where American interests converged with Soviet support for North Korea. A high-stakes game plan based on military and espionage tactics was unfolding. On the morning of January 23, 1968, the crew of the Pueblo was monitoring radio signals when the unexpected happened. The ship, commanded by Commander Lloyd Bucker, was in an area north of the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, an area frequently patrolled by North Korean naval vessels. The Pueblo had been in the vicinity previously to gather intelligence on North Korean naval activity, but this time, there was something very different. A North Korean fighter group consisting of 3 torpedo boats and a submarine chaser had taken off from the shore and was closing in on the vessel. At first, Bucher and his companions thought it was merely a routine encounter, but as the North Korean ships closed in, the tension was palpable. Unarmed and unprepared for a confrontation, the Pueblo's crew had little they could do to defend themselves. They attempted to flee from the North Korean forces, but the Pueblo was a slow ship with limited ability to maneuver. The North Koreans charged the ship, quickly surrounding it with their torpedo boats and shutting down its engines. In international waters, the USS Pueblo was seized. This was an act of aggression that violated decades of naval protocol. At that moment, the crew's fate had been sealed. The North Koreans quickly overran the Pueblo and captured the ship and crew. It was, in their eyes, not only a capture of an enemy ship, but one that declared victory over a powerful opponent. For the United States, The Pueblo's seizure was nothing short of a public relations catastrophe and an indictment against the growing vulnerability of the U.S. Navy on foreign shores. Questions were soon to arise. How could the United States allow such a bold and highly publicized act to occur? Why would the doomed crew of an intercepted ship be totally unprepared for a confrontation that looked so very likely? The ambush. Capture of the USS Pueblo. Seizing the USS Pueblo was done in an agonizingly swift manner. As the North Korean torpedo boats drew near, Commander Lloyd Bucher realized there was no hope of escape. Although the Pueblo had been conducting operations in international waters, it became evident that the North Koreans would not permit the vessel to pass by undisturbed. They had made their move, and the consequences would unfold both rapidly and dramatically. They were ruthless. Several shots were fired from a torpedo boat as the Pueblo attempted to escape, landing dangerously close and sending the crew into a frenzy. Bucher ordered them to turn about and stop retreating with little time to spare. The Pueblo was large and loaded with listening equipment that limited its maneuverability against fast and lightweight enemy vessels. Within minutes, the crew was surrounded and forced to surrender under overwhelming odds. North Korea executed its strike in a well-planned and tactically precise manner. They had watched the Pueblo for weeks, waiting and preparing for exactly this moment. It was a blitzkrieg-style operation, and they overwhelmed the ship in mere minutes. The Pueblo's radio operator sent a distress call at 1:45 p.m., but within seconds it was picked up and jammed by the North Koreans. Without a way to communicate their position or call for help, the ship was doomed. North Korean forces boarded the vessel and opened fire. The crew, largely unarmed, was caught off guard and fled in confusion. They were hit all the harder by the North Korean forces, who fired at anything that moved. Bursts of gunfire sprang up as the sailors ducked for cover. They were totally outmatched, and, with no chance of winning, they had to surrender after a fierce but short fight. The first to fall, Petty Officer Dwayne Hodges was shot and killed during the ongoing assault. His death served as a grim reminder of the ferocity of the North Korean army and the gravity of the situation. The rest of the crew was captured thereafter, their hands bound with cords and blindfolded. The North Koreans wasted no time in ensuring that the crew was firmly under control. The crew endured horrific experiences. Some were tortured and beaten, others were subjected to death threats. A sense of chaos consumed the vessel, leaving the men terrified and uncertain of what was to come next. Commander Bucher ordered the entire crew to surrender to the North Koreans in the hope that more blood would not be shed. It was a decision Bucher would agonize over in the months to follow. He and his crew complied under the threat of further violence, with the North Koreans solidly in control of the ship. The crew was forced onto the North Korean vessels, which immediately left the scene. They were taken to Wonsan, now in the hands of their enemies, where they would begin their harrowing ordeal of captivity. The immediate fate of the crew remained uncertain. After their capture, they were taken to Pyongyang, where they endured psychological and physical torture designed to force them into signing false confessions and admitting that they were spies. The nightmare had only begun, and the seizure of the USS Pueblo set off a chain of dire consequences for both the United States and North Korea. Nightmare in captivity, the torture of the crew. Once the USS Pueblo came under North Korean control, the nightmare for the captured crew began. They were separated and transported to Pyongyang, where they were housed in cramped cells. They were, for the first time, truly prisoners held by a regime that had no qualms about using terror to break them. In the early days of captivity, there was nothing but a sense of terror and uncertainty. The conditions of imprisonment were brutal. The men were devoid of any basic amenities typically offered to prisoners, and they had little or no idea what went on outside their cell walls. Food was scarce, and even when it was provided, it was poor in quality, meager portions of rice, wilted vegetables, and thin broth. Hunger became a constant reminder that survival was not guaranteed. The North Koreans seemed intent on breaking the crew not only physically, but psychologically as well. But the real torture began with the interrogations. From the moment the men set foot on Korean soil, they were subjected to relentless cross-questioning. Their captors accused them of being spies sent by the United States to collect intelligence on North Korea. They were further accused of entering North Korean waters with the sole intention of instigating a conflict. The truth that they were simply conducting a regular reconnaissance operation in international waters meant nothing to the North Koreans. They needed confessions, and they would stop at nothing to get them. The sailors were interrogated one at a time, using methods that were horrendous in their brutality. The men were beaten, deprived of sleep, and threatened with death or the imprisonment of their families. Their captors employed every method possible to force a confession from them and showed no regard for humanity. Those who resisted supposedly faced even worse punishment. Physical beatings were common. One of the more painful forms involved persistent beatings with wooden clubs, fists, and rifle butts. The North Koreans also repeatedly threatened to execute some of the crew members if they did not cooperate. The pressure was intolerable. During one of the propaganda rituals that sailors were forced to take part in, they found a way to fight back during makeshift confession films, where each sailor was forced to appear before North Korean cameras. In one of the iconic acts of defiance that shook the world, some sailors secretly flipped their middle finger during the recording. To the North Koreans, this gesture was dismissed as just part of the script, a harmless slip. To the crew, however, the action was a silent statement of resentment, a relatively small but brave act of rebellion against their captors. The consequences, however, were severe. Afterward, most of the crew were singled out for harsher punishment, more beatings, confinement, and death threats. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The men were not only physically exhausted but pushed to the brink of insanity. They were mentally tortured, fed misinformation about events in the USA, and told by their captors that someone from the government had pleaded for their release but was overruled by other officials. The psychological torture proved to be the cruelest form of torment. Over time, many of the sailors began to believe they would never return home, and that dying in a foreign prison was becoming a growing certainty. Some began to crack under the pressure, admitting to things they knew were untrue, saying anything to end the days of torture. The mental and emotional torment was unimaginable, and the endurance of the crew was tested in ways they never thought possible, especially not when they received their orders to embark on this mission. The signs that the crew had been beaten and tortured were stark. Some bore the marks of the beatings on their bodies for the rest of their lives, while others carried deep psychological scars. However, even in the darkest hour, the men of the USS Pueblo held on to the hope that they would one day return home. They believed this so strongly that no amount of torture could break their spirit or shatter their dignity. The psychological warfare continued, pushing them to the edge of hopelessness in ways that would haunt them forever. The geopolitics, a crisis with global implications. The crew of the USS Pueblo were, physically and mentally, absolutely broken, and this was the start of a diplomatic crisis that would shape international relations between North Korea and the United States for decades to come. While the crew was subjected to endless torture and forced to confess to blatant lies, the US government also had a lot to explain and answer for. There was significant controversy, and Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union-backed North Korean regime rose to alarming new heights. There was no clear solution on the horizon. The United States immediately began working for the release of the sailors captured on the vessel. A highly complex situation emerged for Lyndon B. Johnson's administration: how to avoid triggering hostilities after the seizure of an American warship in international waters. There were two options available: escalating the tensions, thereby risking an outright confrontation with North Korea that could involve the Soviet Union, or opting for diplomacy, which could be interpreted as a sign of weakness by the world. The US military response was strategic and cautious. Several naval vessels were ordered to the area, but under strict orders to avoid any hostilities with North Korea. The 7th Fleet in Japan was put on high alert, with the option to deploy aircraft carriers and fighter jets. But any military action carried significant risks, and the US closely monitored the situation to prevent an escalation that could lead to an open war between the two nations, a scenario both sides wanted to avoid. The story was different for the regime headed by Kim Il-sung, as they considered it a massive victory against their sworn enemies. The regime paraded the crew of the Pueblo on television, and under duress, the men confessed to espionage and apologized for their actions. North Korea wanted the world to believe that the USS Pueblo was indeed involved in espionage and that they had heroically captured it. It was an attempt to embarrass the United States and establish its legitimacy as a military power in the region. However, the heavy-handed methods of North Korea made the choice somewhat simpler for Americans. A majority of public opinion favored military action, and the media was quick to pick up the story. Daily updates painted a vivid picture of the torture and humiliation endured by the crew. However, the US government realized that direct military action carried grave consequences. The ever-looming fear of Soviet involvement and the rising chance of escalation into a global conflict. Negotiations remained tense between the two countries until they reached a diplomatic breakthrough toward the end of 1968. It took close to 11 months of captivity before a deal was reached for the release of the crew. Brokered by the United Nations, the deal involved a combination of diplomatic and political negotiations and included a formal apology from the United States for purportedly breaching North Korean territorial waters, although the US maintained that the Pueblo did not enter territorial waters. The price of the crew's release was steep, but a price the US had no choice but to pay. While the North Koreans demanded an admission of guilt from the US for the incident and an apology from the crew of the ship, it was a bitter pill for the US to swallow, but it was the only way for the men to come home. The sailors were finally released on December 23, 1968. They were physically shattered and psychologically scarred. The trauma and months of captivity had left deep wounds. Yet, they stared death in the face and survived something that, a few months earlier, seemed almost impossible. A hero's welcome awaited their return home to the United States, but the wounds they bore from being held captive in North Korea ran far deeper than anyone could see. It would remain one of the darkest chapters in the history of US-North Korean relations and a vivid reminder of the dangers of Cold War espionage. The negotiations and the return of the crew. It was January 1968, more than 2 decades before the end of the Cold War, when Americans and North Koreans became entangled in an indirect confrontation that further inflamed already volatile relations between the two nations. This incident exposed the vulnerabilities of US intelligence operations and the US naval presence in the Pacific, forcing the government to make tough choices between military retaliation and diplomatic dealings. The Pueblo Incident had repercussions that reached far into the political realm. It forced the United States to reassess its intelligence-gathering methods in East Asia, especially along the coast of North Korea. The Cold War rivalry intensified as the US and Soviet Union engaged in a delicate strategic game at this point. Witnessing the crew's release was a relief and paved the way for political reassessment, but the US had a lot to reconsider. North Korea emerged much enhanced in status for successfully capturing a US ship. The incident was more than a military defeat. It significantly weakened American prestige. For many years after, the USS Pueblo served as a trophy, displayed by North Korea as a symbol of victory in a superpower rivalry, and stood as a painful reminder of the cost of Cold War-era spying. North Korea's seizure of the USS Pueblo is one of the most dramatic and terrifying chapters in Cold War history. Beginning as a routine espionage mission, the affair turned into a nightmare for the crew, as their courage and resilience were tested to the very limits. A combination of psychological torment, physical suffering, and the international diplomatic crisis, their capture set in motion forever changed not only the men on the Pueblo, but also the official relations between the US and North Korea. Though the crew's release in December of 1968 was a relief, it marked the dawn of a long and challenging journey of recovery for the men involved. Their ordeal served as a stark reminder of the gambles taken in international geopolitics. Such moments remain significant in the larger story of the Cold War. For now, that's it for today's video. We hope this story of incredible resistance by the sailors was inspiring. Please join our channel, and as always, we will see you in the next one.